The reason I use the PowerPoint is because some of the stuff I'm going to show you guys today is so outrageous and so incredible that I couldn't actually expect anybody to believe me if I just told you. So I'm going to show you video of these people talking for themselves, and then we don't have to have a discussion on my credibility. You can take it up with them. You're always supposed to start speeches with some kind of joke, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks of this tour, I actually could not think of any joke that would be appropriate, because this stuff is so bad. It's so sad that you almost can't think of anything funny to say about it. But I was speaking in Cleveland a few weeks ago, and somebody came up to me afterwards like, I have a perfect joke for you. So I'm going to give you guys that joke. I thought it was good. So you have an optimist and a pessimist, and they both walk into a bar. And the pessimist says, oh boy, this is all so terrible. It can't possibly get any worse than it is right now. And the optimist says, oh yes it can, you just wait. And it's so appropriate for what we're going to be talking about. Because it is really bad. It's beyond anything that we can imagine. I'm going to show you guys just a sample of it. But it's going to be getting worse, and that's the hard part to imagine. If you had told people 5 years ago that some of the stuff I'm going to show you today was happening or was going to happen within the next 5 years, you would have been laughed at, you would have been ridiculed, they would have called you a kook. If you had told people 50 years that this stuff was going to happen, they would have put you in a straitjacket and taken you to the funny farm, right? Because this stuff is absolutely nuts. The reality is, we're talking about rescuing our children, but this goes beyond just rescuing our children. We're talking about rescuing our nation too, because if we don't rescue our children, we're going to lose everything. We're going to lose our country and our freedoms and our churches and everything else that we hold dear. I want to show you just some of the data that we have right now. Only 50% of Americans say they're sure God exists today. This in a country that was once virtually 100% God-fearing Christian people, right? 3/4 of young Americans, millennials and Generation Z, want the government to pay for their health care. More than 2/3 want the government to give them a free college education. Half would rather live in a socialist country, right? Can you believe that? If you've ever been to a socialist country, if you've ever read a history book, you know that's a really bad idea, a non-common core history book. You know that's a really bad idea. And almost half want to abolish our border agency. So we just not be a country, right? As Trump says, if you get rid of the border, you don't have a country anymore, right? And that's what we're talking about here. And of course, these children didn't wake up believing these things, right? Children, before they're indoctrinated, have this innate understanding that God is real, that they were created by an all-powerful, loving being. And this is true across cultures all over the world. Children understand this until they're brainwashed against that. And they might not know all the details of Scripture, but they do understand that they were created by an intelligent being. And of course, nobody would grow up to be a socialist unless they were evil or indoctrinated to believe such idiocy. Try to take a teddy bear from a 2-year-old. Right? You'll find out real quick 2-year-olds believe in private property. Right? I have one. I can testify to that fact. But half of our young people today are socialists. Here's a socialist, Adolf Hitler, a particularly nasty socialist, a national socialist, who was the leader of the National Socialist Party. And he was wrong about almost everything, but he was right about this. Right? He said, he alone who owns the youth gains the future. And if you think about it, that's self-evident. It's more powerful than armies and navies and anything else you can think of, brainwashing the young people of a nation. And that was Hitler's total strategy, right? I mean, yeah, he had military plans, but even bigger than that, he was brainwashing the young people. He knew that was going to be the key to the success. And in fact, he said it multiple times, right? We're going to have a Reich that's going to last for 1,000 years. How are we going to get there? We're going to brainwash the young people. And boy, did they do it. Today, we're seeing a very similar thing happening, right? Parents are being sidelined, and government is taking over the responsibilities of child rearing. And I want to show you just how blatant they've gotten. I'm going to show you right now a video from MSLSD with a lady called Melissa Harris Perry talking about how they are coming for your children.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
There you go. Because collective farming works so well in the Soviet Union that we should try it with our children, right? Yeah. This is official policy of the United States. These two documents here came out in the waning years of the Obama regime from the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. They call parents in this policy document equal partners with the government in the raising of their own children. Pretty soon, we'll be the junior partners in the raising of our children. If you read this document, they say we need mandatory home visits, we need to go send bureaucrats to all the houses to check that the parents are raising the children the way we think they should be, and if they're not, oh boy, then they need parenting lessons, and if that doesn't work out, we'll just take the kids. Right? And the guy who was running the Department of Education when this came out, Arnie Duncan, said we need government boarding schools. We should have some of these children 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's where this is going, folks. Hillary Clinton told us this was coming. Right? She's got her book, It Takes a Village, and if you read the book, it takes a government village to raise your children. Right? And this is what comes out the other end after the government village does its work. I'm sure if you watched any news at all over the last year or so, you recognize these faces. It's David Hogg and Emma, I forget the girl's last name, with the shaved head. She was running around with a communist Cuban patch on her militia jacket. But one of their fellow students spent 12 years in a government indoctrination camp, got so messed up in the head that he went out and shot his fellow students. And instead of asking what in the world did they subject this poor child to for 12 years in a government brainwash camp, they went and shot up his fellow students and said, I know, we need to disarm all law-abiding Americans, and that'll prevent these things from happening. Well, we've had guns in America since before we were America, and kids didn't used to shoot each other at school. So obviously something has changed, and it's not the guns, it's what they're teaching the kids. Before we get into what's happening in the public school system, I want to point out that there is an end goal to all of this, right? It's not happening in a vacuum. They do have a destination. There is an end point where they're taking us. And rather than tell you about it myself, I'll let them speak for themselves.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So there's a lot to unpack in that statement, but you notice it says, when we are successful, and we will be, right? It's not, well, maybe if we work really, really hard and convince enough people, then we'll be successful. He's positive they're going to be successful. Actually, he died. He went to go meet his maker, and I can't imagine that went very well. But he's 100% confident that they're going to win, right? And why would he be so confident? I submit to you that the reason why is they've got 87% of our children 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for 12 years at least, if they don't go to kindergarten and they don't go to university afterwards, to brainwash them into being prepared for this. And he also tells us a little bit about the new world order that we're heading toward. He says it's going to be one in which a credible United Nations will use its peacekeeping role. Of course, they mean the UN's military role. And just to give you some sense of this, their very first big peacekeeping mission was in Katanga. This province was led by a pro-America Christian guy who supported freedom, wanted a free market. He said, we don't want to live under a mass-murdering, Soviet-backed puppet dictator, so we're going to be our own little country here. This was in Katanga, broke off from the Congo. And the UN said, well, you can't do that. We're going to send our peace armies down there to make sure you don't do that. And they did. And they bombed hospitals, and they bayoneted children, and they raped women, and they shot at cars as they were fleeing, and they just made a absolute mess of the place until the little province would willingly submit to the mass-murdering Soviet-backed communist dictator. Nice people, these guys. Just in the last 10 years, the blue-helmeted UN peace troops have raped an estimated 60,000 women and children, just in the last 10 years. All over the world, right? They all have diplomatic immunity. Not one of them is sitting behind bars where they belong, and they're just running around doing it like it's nothing. That's according to the UN's own numbers, right? The group here, their cries, former UN officials, including senior UN officials and UN investigators, say 60,000 women and children raped by these peace forces just in the last 10 years. And then we're going to use these child-raping peace forces to bring about a world, the one envisioned by the UN's founders. And we know something about the UN's founders, right? There were two big powers at the table. On one side, Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murderers to ever walk on this planet. Him and his minions on one side. And then on our side of the table, we sent this guy called Albert Hiss. And some of you probably remember the name, some of you probably never heard it. But Albert Hiss was, wild guy. They loved him so much, they made him the first Secretary General of the UN. He got to run the conference where they came up with the UN Charter. He took all the delegates down to the Bohemian Grove so they could do their little weird rituals in the northern forests of California. And a few years later, we put him in prison because he was working for Joseph Stalin. Fancy that. So even our people were working for Joseph Stalin. So someone should have asked this guy before he died why we would give up the vision of our founding fathers, the idea that we're all created equal, that God endowed us with inalienable rights. Why would we give up that vision for the vision of the UN's founders, mass murderers and their minions? That's a good question. Obviously, it's not just a Republican thing. It's not even just a Bush thing. Here it is, the Communist Party candidate for 2020.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
A new world order, and here's the rapist bill.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
So they're all on the same page about this new world order. They never bothered to ask us. Actually, George Soros, Moneybags for the Left, said a couple years ago while he was getting his Globalist of the Year award that communist China should, quote, own the new world order. And that'll be fun, won't it? If you want to know more about these people, what they're up to, we've got, they have in the back some special issue, the Deep State that we did. This came out last year, but you'll understand who these people are, what they're up to, and what's really going on. And we'll leave it at that for now, just to say, if you really want to understand this agenda, if you want to understand why they're teaching our children what they're teaching them, you need to, the simplest way to understand all this is to just take everything that God ordained, right, from the very beginning of the Bible through the end, and flip it upside down. So when you hear the word sustainable development, just everything the opposite of what God explained. So God said, be fruitful and multiply, right? God said, subdue the earth. God said there should be private property, right? Thou shalt not steal. God ordained that there should be nations, right? God gave us His laws, and God created male and female, right? So all these things that God has created and ordained, flip them upside down, and you get a good idea of where this is all going. We have a war on our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence. And they have two key international instruments that are paving the way to this new world order. And the reason I bring these up is because they'll explain exactly how they're going to get there. They know perfectly well that the people in this room, that the older generation of Americans is never going to be willing to surrender our private property. We're never going to be willing to accept the idea that there's infinite genders, or that if we just smash the nuclear family and get rid of private property, everything's going to be fine. We're not going to go for that, and they know that full well. They know it's too late to brainwash us on that. And so they'll tell you very clearly that education is the key strategy for bringing this about.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. We're included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
If you listen to CNN fake news, they'll tell you Agenda 21 is a conspiracy theory, right? Well, there's George H.W. Bush talking about it, and here is Nancy Pelosi.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21, to be coordinated under the leadership of a specific office and the direction of a high-level government official. The resolution also urges the United States to identify and initiate further agreements to protect the global environment.
All right, so again, they're all on the same page, and yet they never asked us, right? Here's Agenda 21 for those who don't know. This is a summary created by the people who created Agenda 21. They say it proposes an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. That's all of you, all your children, all your grandchildren, all your great-grandkids, every last person on the planet, every tribesman in the Amazon, every pygmy in the Congo, everybody, right, every American homeschooled Christian child, everybody's supposed to implement this. And then they say effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. So they have really big plans for your life, and they never asked us about it. And then they tell you how are they going to get there, right? But they know they're never going to get to us, but they know they need to brainwash the children. And they tell you in Chapter 36 of Agenda 21, you can read that education is going to be critical for promoting sustainable development. Formal and non-formal education are indispensable to changing people's attitudes. And that's the only way they're going to get this done, is by changing people's attitudes. They say it's critical for achieving environmental and ethical awareness, the right values, attitudes, skills, and behaviors consistent with sustainable development. They say it should include spiritual development, and we'll come back to that, and it should be integrated in all disciplines. So not just in your sustainability class, you need this now in history, in science, in English, everything, right? This is a book that they created for children. The UN created this. It's called Rescue Mission Planet Earth, a children's edition of Agenda 21. So they hand this out to little kids. And this is just one of the atrocities in there. They have the Hindu gods are up on the clouds, and they're very concerned because the storks are delivering babies. And on the next page, you read that the earth groans every time it registers another birth. Did you know that the earth groaned every time a new baby arrived? Well, that's what the UN is teaching our children. And what did I say earlier? God told us to be fruitful and to multiply. And here the UN is telling us that that's bad, right? The earth is groaning, poor earth, every time a new baby comes. And God tells us that people are created in His image. Well, the UN is telling us people are some kind of plague on humanity, and the earth is groaning when new children arrive. I went down to the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in 2012, exactly 20 years after the Agenda 21 summit. And they had these posters everywhere. They had conscripted children to draw them, obviously. And I don't know if you guys can see, but it's a sick earth, and he's got the thermometer sticking out of his mouth. And the doctor comes and diagnoses the problem. Says, I know you have humans. So humans are a disease on the planet. But the UN is going to save us from this wretched disease, or not us, but Mother Earth. Then they have Agenda 2030, which is like the new and improved Agenda 21. They got this in 2015. Obama led the way. Of course, Pope Francis was thrilled with it. Every last tin pot dictator on the planet thought it was great. The Communist Chinese Party, after it was adopted by everybody, said, oh, we played a crucial role in bringing this about. And the head of NATO, a socialist by the name of Javier Solana, a couple years ago, said this was going to usher in the next great leap forward. And if you know anything about the last great leap forward, that should send shivers down your spine, because tens of millions of people died in the process. It was not a fun time. Here's the UN telling you how they're going to get to this sustainable world order.
For all our differences and diversity, the world can agree on one thing. Education is at the heart of a sustainable future for us all.
Education is at the heart of a sustainable future, and if you read this document, they'll tell you that, right? Your children are critical agents of change. This is right from Agenda 2030. You can read it on the UN site. And they're going to use these new goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that make up Agenda 2030, to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. Well, that sounds so nice, doesn't it? Well, what do they mean by a better world? We don't have to speculate. Thankfully, they tell us. If you go to goal number 10, they tell you what this will look like. And this could have been ripped straight out of the Communist Party manifesto of Cuba or Zimbabwe or North Korea. We're going to reduce inequality within and among countries, right? So national socialism is not enough. We're going to have global socialism. We're going to redistribute. And of course, they're not talking about taking money from the Rockefellers and the George Soros and the Rothschilds and so on. They're talking about taking money from you and redistributing it to themselves and to their third world crony dictators who've impoverished the third world, right? They say this is only going to be possible if the wealth is shared and if income inequality is addressed. So again, we've seen this movie before, and it always ends the same way. Starvation, mass shortages, concentration camps, gulags, torture, etc. Right? Not the kind of future we want. Again, in goal number 4, they tell you how they're going to get there, because they know they're never going to get us. So how are they going to get us? They're going to get our kids. And they tell you in goal number 4 that by 2030, all learners, again, no asterisks exempting American homeschoolers or tribesmen in the Amazon, all learners need to have the knowledge and skills, not just to passively submit to this totalitarian ideology called sustainable development, but to actually promote it. And that's going to take some doing, right? Because, I mean, how are they going to persuade my kids to promote sustainable development? I'm going to teach them that sustainable development, getting rid of private property, getting rid of the family, redistributing wealth, I mean, that's all evil stuff. So how are they going to do it? It's going to take some serious brainwashing. The head of the UN, when they adopted this, Ban Ki-moon said it was the Global Declaration of Interdependence. This was, of course, a direct swipe on our Declaration of Independence. The head of the UN General Assembly, which they're now calling the Parliament of Humanity, where Kim Jong-un, Rocket Man, gets the same vote as we do, he called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And they must love this term, because then suddenly they were all blabbering about this new Master Plan for Humanity. And they say all countries are going to implement it, and we're going to save Mother Earth. And here they are again telling us how they are going to successfully bring this about.
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So sustainable development begins with education, and we have to put global education first. And I want to show you guys how this process works, because we've seen how effective they can be. In the early 1990s, The LGBT thing was not even on people's radar. Nobody was thinking about it. Sodomy was still a crime across most of the United States, and this was not on people's radar. And then they created this documentary. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues in school. And they started showing this in first grade, second grade classrooms, in government schools all across America. I'm going to show you a quick little clip from that documentary, which was shown to lots and lots of our children in public schools, and we'll see what happened next.
One homosexual teacher steers his kids to the politically correct view of marriage.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I don't see why they shouldn't get married. I know, I mean, they love each other. It's just like any other people. I think gay people should get married. Guys, they love someone, let them get married. I know. Let's say if Andres wanted to get married to Eric. I'm just doing this, but I am the judge, and I'm saying, no, you 2 can't get married. I don't care if you love them. You can't get married. How do you think you guys will feel? Mad? Yeah, exactly. So you think that they can't get married? I don't know.
And they show a bunch of little kids, oh yeah, you should totally be allowed to get married. And again, this wasn't on anybody's radar screen, right? So people were didn't even have their defenses up, because we didn't even suspect this was coming. And yet, within a generation, pretend judges on the Supreme Court were striking down all of our, I mean, they couldn't even get this passed in California, the land of fruits and nuts, right? If they're using, the democratic process. So they had to use the pretend judges, and they knew we were never going to think that was okay, so they brainwashed the kids to think it was okay. And now I want to show you how far we've fallen just in one generation as a result of what's happening in the schools. This is Good Morning America. This is about as mainstream America as can get.
And if you haven't heard the name Desmond Napoles, get ready for this trailblazing 11-year-old drag kid who RuPaul is calling the future. His bravery is inspiring so many. We're going to talk to him in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at his amazing story.
I am Desmond. I'm 11 years old, and I like pizza, trains, and drinking root beers since it's caffeine-free. I also do drag, and I love to put on makeup, dresses, and wigs, and of course, jewelry if necessary. My full drag name is Desmond is Amazing. I feel very happy to have a mom that accepts me.
It really touches me deeply that there are other children out there that he's reaching and they're listening to him and he's influencing them to be themselves.
I'm very proud of him. I'm proud that he's found his path so early.
My greatest joy in this is just seeing Desmond happy.
I love doing drag because it makes me feel amazing and self-expressive. It just feels amazing to know that people love what I do. My one big message would be 3 words: be yourself always.
Please welcome Desmond Napoles, a.k.a. Desmond is Amazing.
All it took was one generation of brainwashing the children in the school, and that's what's on national television today. So that's how the process works, right? First they go for the children, then they spring the trap, and then they get the rest of us. And so now I'm going to show you what they're teaching the kids today in government school, and it'll sound just as ridiculous as it would have sounded for me 20 years ago to tell you they were preparing the children for a right to a homosexual marriage through the pretend judges on the Supreme Court. They're teaching the kids that the gas we all exhale, about 2 pounds every day, carbon dioxide, is this toxic pollution that's going to kill us all unless we let the UN tax and regulate it. And, sensible people who were educated prior to the 2000s hear that, they're like, what in the world? CO2, that's plant food, right? I mean, it's in every one of our sodas. I mean, that's crazy. And in fact, human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of 1% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I can assure you they don't control the temperature. They're not going to make the seas rise. They're not going to make Bigfoot come get us. It's all a bunch of lies. And they know that, they've done the polling. They know that older Americans overwhelmingly recognize that this is asinine, that it's ludicrous. And so they're training the kids to accept it. They're telling them that this gas is a pollution, and that if we don't let the UN tax and control it, we're all doomed. So I want to show you first what the UN says, and then what they're teaching our kids in American classrooms in government schools all over the country.
We hope that as many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts. Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
Education is a tool to address climate change? Think about the absurdity of that statement. The climate has been changing since the planet has been here, right? And how are you going to educate people to stop changes in the climate? It's absolutely ludicrous. And you know, sensible people who see that think, what in the world? And of course, this is made by UNESCO, the UN's education agency. And I want to show you what this education to stop climate change actually looks like.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault. And the consequences will be terrible.
Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries. The water might rise and it might flood the whole town. We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes. Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see?
Oh, can't you see what global warming is doing? Can't you see? Oh, can't you see what global warming is doing to me?
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and it's to the congressman or woman. It's for Congress to pass comprehensive climate and energy legislation.
So you get this great certificate that you can take home, and then there's also a list of things that you can do at home and in your classroom that your teacher has to help you. You can bring it home and talk to your family about it and how you can help at home.
And then this is what comes out on the other end, right? A bunch of brainwashed zombies who think we need to surrender all power, authority, and freedom to the United Nations to save us from the gas that we exhale. You know, and they could never do this without brainwashing the children through the public school system. And you know, right now, to us, it sounds totally ridiculous that the UN would be able to tax the gas we exhale. And you know, if it was up to us, it wouldn't happen. But they know if they brainwash successfully 87% of our young people, which is what's happening right now, they will be able to get it done within a generation, and that's what's coming, folks. Charlotte Iserbyt, she was the senior policy advisor to the U.S. Department of Education in the Ronald Reagan administration, and really great lady. She's become a friend of mine, wonderful, wonderful lady. And here is her explaining what's happening in the public school system.
I think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic. The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
And here it is from one of the ladies who was involved in the writing of national standards during the Bush and the Clinton administrations. This is Shirley McCoon. She's with the Mid-Continental Regional Educational Laboratory, and she was commissioned along with some others to start working on national standards. And here she is speaking to the National Governors Association. This is in the late 80s, mind you. And she's going to explain the same thing that Charlotte just explained, but from the perspective of, hey, this is great, isn't this wonderful, what we need?
It seems to me that far too much of our efforts have been focused on the issue of let's find a short-term fix and fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society.
So a new era with a total transformation of our society, and here is the role the schools are playing.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is, and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of schools.
So the social change function of school. You suppose this lady's got a crystal ball, she's going to go figure out what's going to happen in 50 years and then figure out how to educate the children for that? It's ludicrous, right? She's going to read the tea leaves or read your palm. This is absolutely ridiculous. But what she's explaining here, the social change function of schools, they're going to decide what do they want to happen in 50 years, what do they want the children to believe, and then they're going to reverse engineer. So what do we need to brainwash the kids to believe so that we can get to the end destination that we want? The total restructuring of our society, as she so eloquently put it. A big part of this, as I mentioned, is a war on everything that is true, that is good, that is beautiful, that God has ordained. And part of that is the sexualization, the perversion, and the confusion of our children. So at Chasco Middle School in Florida, this is all pretty recent stuff. And again, if I had told you a generation ago this would be happening, nobody would have believed it. It just would have been too crazy. But at Chasco Middle School, there was a girl, she said, actually, you know what, I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body. And so instead of saying, actually, sorry, honey, you're really a girl, you're going to probably need to get some help, because, you know, it would be like telling an anorexic kid, you know, oh, yeah, you really are totally fat. You really should go, doing liposuction. It would be cruel. And yet they told this little girl, oh, maybe you are a boy trapped in a girl's body. Why don't you go shower and change with the boys before PE class? And so that's what happened. They actually prohibited the teachers from telling the boys that a girl would be coming in there while she walked in and caught them with their pants down, literally. And they ordered the male PE teacher to go in and supervise all this. And he said, well, I can't do that. There's a naked underage girl in there. We used to throw people in prison for that. I'm not doing it. And so they said, we're going to take away your teaching credential. We're going to fire you. You'll never work as a teacher again. And then Liberty Counsel sued. They got the emails. They said, we need to use this guy as an example so that no other teachers will ever dare to stand up against this craziness. Minnesota was even more crazy. A boy woke up one day and claimed he was a girl. And, hey, Mom, Dad, can I have a sex change surgery? Yeah, absolutely, positively not. So the school knew better than the parents. They took him to go have his genitals surgically removed as part of a sex change surgery, put him on hardcore drugs. And now there's a lawsuit about it, but of course the boy's genitals are not coming back, right? That ship has sailed. And this is what they're teaching children in California now. They recommend this for 5-year-olds. It's Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. And that old-fashioned notion of male and female? Well, that's actually bigotry. That's hate. Today we're older and wiser, and we realize that gender is a spectrum. So you can actually be any one of infinite numbers of genders. They give 15 examples that the kids can choose from. They can be non-binary, transgender, agender, bigender, trigender, neutral, free spirit, and a whole bunch of things I can't even pronounce. And they say that adults have to guess what gender babies are because babies can't talk yet, right? So this is what they're teaching the kids. This is another reason why I bring the PowerPoint, because nobody could believe this if I didn't have the video. This was sent to me by a concerned mother in California. I actually got the curriculum this school was using, the school district, and now in California it's the law that the schools have to teach the children the history of the LGBT movement. And so they were teaching the kids the history of the LGBT movement, and in that history they included basically the rape of children, right? Greek men, they used to take young boys under their wing, and they would do unspeakable things that we can't discuss in polite company or any company at all. And that they were teaching the kids. That's part of the history of the LGBT movement. And so this mom goes and asks the assistant superintendent, why are you teaching my kids about pedophilia? And in a sane world, they would say, well, we would never do that. What are you talking about? Here's what she actually said.
Tell me why you're teaching pedophilia in school to 9th graders.
Teaching what?
Pedophilia, pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something,
a man and a boy is a sexual orientation.
Something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important.
So I don't know if you were able to catch all that, but it's something that has occurred in history. So it's really important that we teach that. Well, plenty of things occurred in history, right? Jesus walked on this planet, the pilgrims came over for the glory of God and for the advancement of the kingdom. Right? All these things happen in history. They're not teaching the kids about it. Our founding fathers said we declare that God gave us rights, and that's why we institute God. They don't teach kids that anymore. So obviously, just because something occurred in history, that's not the standard by which they decide what should be taught. And notice she also said it's a sexual orientation. Well, think about the implications of this. In California and 26 other states today, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. And, we all recognize that, a pedophile is not a sexual orientation and we can't discriminate against, but they're teaching the kids that, pedophilia, raping children is a sexual orientation, and it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. So how long before these kids grow up to be adults say, oh, you have to hire a pedophile to run your Sunday school ministry at church. You have to hire a pedophile to run your school, right? That's where this is all going. And that's what they're teaching the kids. This is the drag queen story hour, right? So a man dressed up as a woman, and this particular one decided to wear demon horns, I guess, so everybody would know where they were coming from, right? This is happening all over America. If you go to their website, they brag, oh, we go into first grade classrooms, second grade classrooms, kindergartens, public libraries, all over the place. And they have the testimonials from the teachers about how great it was. They come in, they read LGBT stories to the children. The header has two mommies, the homosexual worms who got married, all this kind of stuff. Some of these have actually been exposed as convicted pedophiles. And they're coming in and they're wrestling with the children, having the children lie down on them and teaching them about the wonders of being a drag queen. This is happening in government school, and I was in South Carolina a few weeks ago. I said, I'm sure it's not happening in South Carolina yet, and the audience very quickly corrected me. They said, oh no, just last week they were here in Greenville. We had a big debate about this. So it's happening everywhere, folks. This is Jessica Lahore, a drag queen they brought into a middle school in Colorado for Career Day. So, I wrote an article that is really appropriate to bring in drag queens, and it wasn't clear if they brought in prostitutes and strippers. And the big mob of drag queens came after me. They said, you're intolerant, you should kill yourself. I'm serious. So in the name of tolerance, people who don't think this is good for children should kill themselves. And this is having profound effects on the children, right? I was a kid not that long ago, and not once throughout my entire childhood, 8 countries on 4 continents, not once did I ever meet a boy who thought he was a girl or a girl who thought she was a boy. Never once. And I met probably tens of thousands of kids. Never once met a kid who didn't accept what sex God gave them. Well, now in California, this just came out last year from the UCLA, 27% of California's children are now gender nonconforming. So boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. How long do we have to wait? Do we have to wait until it's 50% or 75% until we finally say enough teaching our children this stuff? Well, it's happening all over America. This survey from NBC Fake News found that 20% of millennials now identify as LGBTQ, and that's one of the reasons I no longer identify as a millennial. Thank you very much. This is UNESCO. They put out these global sex education standards last year. They want 5-year-olds to know about sexual pleasure and masturbation. In what universe do 5-year-olds need to know about sexual pleasure and masturbation? Unless you're grooming them for something, right? They want 9-year-olds to be able to defend taxpayer-funded abortion. They want kindergartners to know about all the different genders they can be. They want to teach them about homosexuality and fornication. And then they have in the back for those annoying parents who ask all these questions. And they say, oh, well, you can tell the parents, this is all evidence-based. This is all science-based curriculum. And you turn to the evidence page, and who do you find? Well, the biggest butcher of unborn children in America, Planned Parenthood, listed more than 20 times as their source of scientific evidence for why we need to teach 5-year-olds about sexual pleasure. Sick stuff, right? Here they are, and there's hundreds of these videos if you go on YouTube, conscripting little kids to sing praises to Dear Leader.
Okay, now everybody, let's sing it together on the count of 3. All right, I like that. 1, 2, 3.
Barack Hussein Obama, he said all must lend a hand to make this country strong again. Barack Hussein Obama, he said it must be fair today, equal work means equal pay. Barack Hussein Obama.
Can you imagine if they had the kids singing, Trump, 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 he's going to make America great again, right? Oh man, that'd be a racist scandal like you couldn't imagine. The talking heads on CNN would be exploding on camera. And of course, Obama wasn't going to make America strong again, right? He was going to make America dumber than ever before. He brought us these Common Core state standards. I'm sure you've heard of them because they're taught in every public school in Montana and every other state. Just to give you some sense of how atrocious these are, they put together a Common Core validation committee. And this was supposed to be the committee that was going to tell us all how great Common Core was and how wonderful it would be to mandate it in all 50 states. Well, they had 2 subject matter experts on this committee, and only 2. This is the English language expert, the only one. Her name is Sandra Stofsky. A very nice lady, but she's fine with national standards. And she looked at these and she said, well, hey, this is going to reduce the ability of children to develop critical thinking skills. We're taking out all the great literary study and we're replacing it with nonsense. No, I'm not going to sign off on that. Right? So they took her name off and pretended she never existed. This is Dr. Louisa Moats. She's one of the reading experts who was hired to help develop the early literacy standards in Common Core. Well, they took out all the stuff she put in and replaced it with a bunch of quackery, and so she's now saying, hey, kids don't learn how to read this way. No way, this is bad, bad news, and she's speaking out. This was the only math expert they put on the Common Core Validation Committee, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford University. He said the Common Core math standards are written to reflect very low expectations. They're as non-challenging as possible with extremely serious failings. There are actual errors in the math. They are neither mathematically correct nor especially clear, and so why don't we mandate them in all 50 states, right? This is what it looks like.
What does Common Core mean for your kids? Well, here's a sample math problem.
Compose and decompose numbers from 11 to 19 into 10 ones and some further ones by using objects or drawings, and record each composition.
That's my producer, Ricky Ratliff, right outside the studio, asking people to solve a Common Core math problem.
10 plus 8. Understand that these numbers are composed of 10 ones and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Seem complex? No kidding. And yet that is a problem for kindergarten students, 5- and 6-year-olds. Seems crazy to me. Here's a question some first graders will get under the standards.
Okay, kids, class is in session.
What is 32 minus 12? 20, right? You just subtract. But not under the new Common Core method.
Why are they going through this backwards method here?
This man who trained in nuclear engineering couldn't understand it.
I don't understand.
You get a sense of how atrocious these math standards are, and then next time you go to McDonald's, you wonder why the 20-year-old kid can't make change for a $5 bill. Now you know, right? They hate math because they're learning quackery, right? They're not learning how to do math correctly, and of course, math actually turns out to be really important for other thinking ability, right? If you can't do math, you really struggle to think, and that's exactly what they want. The same maniacs who brought you Common Core also created national science standards. It's called the Next Generation Science Standards, and it's really not science at all. In fact, it's indoctrination. They don't even teach the kids the scientific method. I wonder why, right? Because maybe they recognize that none of this stuff is science. But the two big takeaways at every level throughout these standards: one, the gas you exhale is a toxic pollution and only the UN can save us with global taxes on carbon dioxide. And the other, you came from slime soup that turned into a fish that somehow became a squirrel and eventually turned into a monkey, and there's no God and now you're here, right? Over billions of years. As long as you believe those two things, we'll call you a scientist and you'll be good. But if you don't agree with those two things, then we have a problem, right? They're also teaching the kids fake history. They're teaching the kids, for example, if you look at these Common Core aligned history textbooks, it's almost too much to be believed. On the Pilgrims, for example, if they do talk about the Mayflower Compact, I've seen it in several. They say, we undertook a voyage, ... to America. And so what's in the ... Well, the whole reason they undertook the voyage, right? For the glory of God, to spread the gospel, to advance the kingdom. So they don't want them to know those things. They instead want them to believe that they came over here to enslave and rape and pillage and be mean to the Indians, which of course is not true, right? They came over here for the reasons they told us they were coming over here, but they won't teach the kids that. If you read about the Second Amendment in the Common Core aligned history books, they say, oh, it's so that the government can have a militia. Because they needed a constitutional amendment so they could have a militia, huh? My friend and colleague, Dr. Duke Pesta, who's been working on this project with me very closely, he's a university professor, and he's been teaching at different universities for many, many years now. And every year for the last 10 years, they've been doing a survey of all the kids coming in from the government schools. He says that every year he's given this survey, over half of his students believe that America invented slavery. Now, if these kids had had a proper education at all, they know that slavery is this ubiquitous institution that's been with humanity almost from the dawn of time, in virtually every culture, every civilization on planet Earth, throughout virtually all of recorded history. And yet the kids don't know that, right? They also don't know that the principles America was founded on, the idea that God created us equal and the idea that God gave us rights and that's why we create governments. Those are the principles that were responsible for ending slavery, not just in America, but all over the world, right? You can still buy and sell slaves legally in Mauritania in 2007. And they're teaching the kids that America invented slavery. We're a uniquely evil nation, right? Because we invented this abominable institution. And so you wonder why the kids want to burn down America. Now you know, right? They think America is evil because they're being brainwashed. This is in Kansas, but it's happening all over the place. They got the 5 pillars of Islam, right? Making the kids recite the Islamic Shahada, Allah is God and Muhammad is his messenger. They make the kids go to a mosque and take off their shoes and bow down so they can practice. And just imagine if they had the 10 Commandments up in a government school. And the ACLU would be on you like flies on poop, right? But the 5 pillars of Islam, no problem. They're gathering a lot of data on how children react to this stuff. But this here is a robot called EMAR. The federal government funded it because they figured out that kids would be more likely to give their mental health data to a robot than to a person. And they are gathering more data on your children than you can possibly imagine. Hundreds and hundreds of data points. What do your kids' teeth look like? They give the kids surveys. How does your dad talk to your mom? How does your mom talk to your dad? What kind of food do you have in the fridge? Do you guys have guns at home? Do you go to church every weekend? Do you like your parents? Do you do any drugs? Do you think about having lots of sex? Have you had lots of sex? Do you like to do drugs? Every kind of question you could possibly imagine, they're asking the kids. It's all going into databases. It's all being recorded in DC. And they know more about your children now than you do, guaranteed. This image here on your right-hand side, you see all these different technological tools they're using to gather data on the children. All the way on the left, you see the facial expression camera. I pulled this right out of a Department of Education report. And they tell you this facial expression camera is supposed to analyze the facial expressions that children make when they're exposed to different stimuli and record those facial expressions into the computer system so the computer system knows how the child reacted. So hypothetically, maybe a guy comes in wearing some demon horns and a dress and he reads LGBT stories to children and the kids go, ooh, what in the world is that? Why are they doing this? And the computer system says, aha, this one needs an intervention, right? And they'll say that's the purpose of this technology. They figure out who needs to have an intervention. And if they don't have the right attitudes, values, and beliefs, they need an intervention. This is what they're telling us, right? The new fad is the social and emotional learning. It's not really academic learning. They want the kids to have the right values and attitudes. This came from another Department of Education report. They tell you that the data captured from users' online behaviors will enable algorithms to infer the user's knowledge, intentions, and interests, and to create models for predicting their future behavior and interests. So they're going to be able to predict your children's future behavior and interests using all this information they're gathering. I mentioned, tearing apart children's values. A big part of that, and this was personal because this was used on me as a child, and I remember the profound impact it had. But UNESCO's got a global guide for this, for values clarification, they call it. And they'll tell you in the manual for teachers all over the world that the purpose is to undermine children's belief in moral absolutes. Well, why would they want to undermine children's belief in moral absolutes? And the way they do it is very clever. Probably the easiest way to explain it is an example. So it's something similar to what they told me as a kid. They say, hey, you're in a lifeboat, and you get together with a group of kids. You guys are all in a lifeboat, and the lifeboat can only hold 8 people, but there's 9 of you. And you have a doctor, and a policeman, an engineer, a lawyer, a teacher, and you got to get rid of somebody, or you're going to sink. Who do you get rid of? And everybody knows the correct answer is the lawyer, but just kidding. If the kids put their thinking cap on for a minute and said, well, hey, why don't we just take turns swimming alongside the raft and then we don't have to kill anybody, that would make sense. But what the kids are supposed to come up with is, hey, well, my parents told me we shouldn't murder, my pastor told me we shouldn't murder, the Bible says we shouldn't murder, but here the only moral solution would be for us to murder somebody so that all the rest of us can survive. It's for the common good, right? It's for the greater good of society. And so kids go away thinking, aha, morality is not actually black and white. There is no right and wrong. It depends on the situation you're in. Maybe there is a time and a place for concentration camps or for killing unborn babies or post-born babies or old people or whatever the case may be. Maybe we do need to get rid of someone for the greater good. And so that's what kids leave thinking. My parents were wrong. The Bible was wrong. My pastor was wrong. Morality really is subjective. Ethics are situational. And that's what kids walk away believing. That's what I walk away believing. And that's why they do this, right? Obviously, the children are not getting what we would call an education. And you don't have to believe me. The government will tell you. They do every couple of years a national assessment of educational progress. And the results speak for themselves. Over 2/3 of 8th graders are below proficient on the dumbed-down math standards. We're not talking calculus or even algebra. We're talking as dumbed down as you can possibly get and still call it an education. Just 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in English, just 1/4 of high school seniors are proficient in math, and about 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading. And of course, these high school seniors go on to become illiterate adults. The federal government did a literacy survey in 1993. They categorized Americans into 5 categories. 1 was completely illiterate, couldn't read a stop sign to save your life. 2 is pretty close to that. 5 is a good reader. Well, half of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. In 2003, they did another survey, same thing. Half of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. So about half of our people are illiterate. And nobody goes around bragging about that, so you probably don't hear much about it. Your neighbor's not going to say, hey, guess what, I can't read. It's just not something people normally talk about. But about half of Americans today, according to the government's data, are illiterate. In some places like Washington, D.C., more than 2/3 of the adult population is illiterate. And most of them have a high school diploma, which taxpayers spent $150,000 to give them. And they can't read their high school diploma. So that's the situation we're in. And then Washington, D.C. schools, they said, oh, we clearly have a problem when this report came out. And guess where they went to figure out how to fix it? Communist Cuba. I kid you not. They got the mayor, the school superintendent, the school board leaders, they sent them all down to Cuba for a paid junket to learn how the Cubans do education. Isn't that cute? Ronald Reagan put together this commission back in the 1980s, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, and they said that the educational foundations of our society are being eroded in a way that threatens our future as a nation and as a people. So think about that. Our future is threatened as a nation and as a people. And that was in the 80s, right? We had a great education system compared to what we have today in the 80s, and it's getting worse. They said if an unfriendly foreign power had done this to us, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. And I say we should view it as an act of war because it was. And in fact, we were not always this stupid. In fact, we were once the best educated, most highly literate people on the entire planet. John Adams wrote in a letter to his friend that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. You know, it's possible that you might see one sometime, but it's not something you see every day. Thomas Jefferson would brag that American farmers were the only ones in the world who read Homer. And go ask some high school graduates today about Homer, see what you get. Don't, right? Somebody don't even get the joke. The Federalist Papers, these were written for average, everyday Americans. They were written for farmers and blacksmiths and shopkeepers, right? Normal people. Go try to find a college graduate today to read it in modern English. What? It doesn't make any sense. The University of Montana, they did a survey, this scholar Kenneth Lockridge, he found out that between 1787 and 1795, about 90% of Americans could read, almost 100% in places like Boston. This guy, back in 1812, did a national survey on our education system. He found that not more than 4 in 1,000 Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. Well, I can't write legibly. I can't even read my own handwriting. So, obviously there was something right back then that we're not doing today. And, the kids who did go to an actual school, which, it wasn't considered necessary because people got a lot of education at home, but the kids who did go to an actual school, they already knew how to read when they got to school. Their parents taught them how to read. Their older siblings taught them how to read. Their grandparents or their uncles and aunts. And they did it using very simple tools like these. You could buy them for a nickel at the general store, right? The New England Primer, the original Blueback Speller by Noah Webster. Basic tools that anybody could use to teach how to read. And as a side benefit, they also taught values and morality, right? In Adam's fall, we all sin, and that kind of stuff as the kids learned how to read. Then along came this guy. He had been to Prussia, and he really was enamored with the Prussian indoctrination system. He saw what the Prussian dictatorship was doing. They had passed a law saying parents should give their children to the government for education, and they were brainwashing them to be good little statists. Education of the state, by the state, for the state, right? And, I think a lot of Americans today struggle to realize how revolutionary that was. The idea that government would educate children in the 1800s was just inconceivable. It was crazy, the idea that government would educate kids. The government schools was unheard of. And Horace Mann brought these to America, and he was a socialist. He thought that government education would equalize all men, as he put it. He wanted to get the Bible out of the schools, which again was a radical, revolutionary idea. And he also introduced this idea called the whole word method for teaching reading. It was developed by a reverend with the best of intentions. He thought, well, deaf children can't hear sounds, and so you can't teach them that a P is a P and a T is a T. So let's just get them to memorize the whole word. And for deaf children, that was a big step forward. For non-deaf children, it was cataclysmic, and it produced the symptoms that we today call dyslexia on a massive scale. So within a few years, all the schoolmasters in Boston rose up. They wrote this brilliant essay explaining what quackery this was. They said the change proposed by Mr. Mann is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning, and so we're not going to do it. And that was the end of that. Didn't hear about it for a long time. Over in Europe, around the time that Horace Mann was promoting this in America, this government school idea, these guys were promoting government schools in Europe, especially in Germany, what we today call Germany. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They said the education of all children from the moment they can get on without their mother's care should be in state institutions. And again, this was very radical at the time, and within a few generations we saw what that led to, right? The Germans were goose-stepping around and saying Heil Hitler and putting people in camps and invading their neighbors, right? It didn't work out well for the Germans. It's not going to work out well for us either. 50 years after Horace Mann, we got this guy, John Dewey, and he is almost universally regarded today as the founding father of America's public school system. In fairness, Horace Mann probably deserves some of the credit as well, but John Dewey gets most of the credit today. And rather than going to Prussia, he went to the Soviet Union to see what they were doing. He wanted to see what Lenin was doing. He thought it was fantastic. He wrote these articles in the New Republic about how great it was going over there. He was so pleased that the schools were instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children through the education system. He wanted America to be a socialist country. He thought it was much too Christian and way too individualistic. He didn't like the Constitution. He didn't like the Founding Fathers. And so he wrote this essay. We reprinted it in the book that we have in the back, Crimes of the Educators. And basically he said, we spend all this time teaching the kids how to read and write and do math. They really don't need to learn that, especially when they're so young. What we really need to do is focus on socializing them so they'll be good little collectivists. But he knew, as he wrote, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew this would not go over well with parents and teachers. So he went to the Rockefellers instead. They gave him $3 million, which at the time was massive amounts of money. So he hired an army of people, got a bunch of disciples, and they went around the country promoting this quackery. One of the things they worked on was creating new reading tools, which by the end of World War II were being adopted all over the country. Dick and Jane, for example, Macmillan readers. And it ended up being a disaster. So that by 1955, this guy, Rudolf Flesch, wrote this book exposing it, Why Johnny Can't Read. And he explained very diplomatically, the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. So this caused a national scandal, and because of that scandal, probably many of the people in this room today can read. Now we have scientific proof, that this quackery does not work. And now we can do brain scans on the children who have been exposed to this whole word quackery versus the children who learn how to read with phonics. And what the brain scans show is that you actually get physical damage, actual harm that you can see on a brain scan when you teach children to read using this quackery known as the whole word method. And so the guy who does it, he's a progressive, but he says that psychology, cognitive psychology, directly refutes the idea that you can teach children to read properly using the whole word method. And so you're probably not surprised to know that this is exactly what they do under Common Core. Right? This is right from the Common Core state standards. Children need to learn how to read words by sight. And then when you complain, you say, hey, you need to teach my kids phonics. Oh, don't worry, we teach your kids phonics. Yeah, after they harm them and get this harmful reflex instilled in their minds in kindergarten, right? So it does tremendous damage. Now UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, wants this all over the world. They have the Global Guide to Teaching Reading. They say children should be able to learn a sight vocabulary. So back to John Dewey. This guy was a very religious man, not in the sense that we might recognize, but he described himself as a religious man. He and his buddies wrote the first Humanist Manifesto, and the very first tenet of the Humanist Manifesto is a direct quote. They said, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So they had faith that the universe was self-existing, that it was not created. And if you ask me, that's a very irrational faith that's not supported by the evidence, but that's what they believed, and that's the religion they wanted taught in all the schools of America. And so, if you know the first words of your Bible, you know that is a direct attack on the very first words of Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so he was telling us right off the bat, we reject all that Bible stuff, that Christianity stuff. And even if you're not a Christian, and even if you don't take the Bible as seriously as I think you should, this has really serious implications for you too, right? Our founding fathers said it was a self-evident truth that God created us, that he created us equally, that he endowed each of us with inalienable rights, and that we institute governments to protect these rights. So that was what our founding fathers believed. Notice they didn't say it was a religious statement. It's just a self-evident truth. You don't even have to read your Bible. You don't even have to be a Christian to recognize that God created you and that he endowed you with certain inalienable rights. If you go out in the forest and chop down some logs and build yourself a cabin, and someone comes along and says, hey, that's my cabin, you understand innately, no, wait a minute, I built that cabin, that's mine, right? Again, 2-year-olds understand it. Take a teddy bear from a 2-year-old, you'll find out how quickly, how obvious it is that private property rights are self-evident. Right? And yet, John Dewey said, no. If you read the rest of his manifesto, it's basically just communism wrapped up in religious garbage. He said we've got to have a cooperative economic order, we've got to get rid of the profit motive, we have to have equitable distribution of the means of production or the means of life. And of course, this is not a new religion, right? The idea that man can be his own little God and decide for himself what's right and wrong. Because that's what their religion is, right? Man is his own God. They believe that each one of them is a little God. And we've heard this before, haven't we? In Genesis 3:5, God knows that when you do that, when you disobey God, then your eyes will be open and you'll be your own little God, right? You can decide what's good and evil. And incredibly as it seems, the Supreme Court actually declared that this religion shall be the established religion of the United States, and today it is taught to all of our children at taxpayer expense in religious institutions called government schools all over America. So in 1962, the Supreme Court struck down prayer in the state of New York. You know, this was a non-sectarian prayer. It was developed by Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and it was very simple. You know, God, we acknowledge our dependence on you. We beg your blessings on our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that anymore. Then in 1963, they removed the Bible. They said you can't have the Bible. It was a lawsuit involving the school district, the Abington School District, and they said the First Amendment requires these rulings. Well, I'm sure some of you guys have read the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law. Right? Is the state of New York Congress? Is the Abington School District Congress? Of course it's not, right? And they say, oh, well, we have to incorporate this First Amendment to apply to all the states and local governments. Well, if you know anything about American history, which a lot of Americans did not, obviously, or they would have protested this, but when the Founding Fathers wrote the First Amendment, more than half of our states had established churches and established religions. So if you had told the Founding Fathers that one day the Supreme Court would abolish prayer and Bible in school because of the First Amendment, they would have looked at you like you were cuckoo. And yet that's exactly what they did. And worse, they went a step further. The Supreme Court did exactly what Congress was prohibited from doing. They established a national religion. And this justice, Justice Potter Stewart, actually recognized what they were doing. He wrote in his dissent that the refusal to permit the religious exercises is seen not as state neutrality when it comes to religion, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, as John Dewey would have called this religion. And so what the Supreme Court did was exactly what Congress was not allowed to do. They established a national religion and required us all to support it with our tax money. Now we are going toward a global education system, and this has been in the works for generations. Back in the 1940s, the UN created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said education shall be compulsory, and it shall further the activities of the United Nations. Well, what if you believe that the United Nations is a terrible dictators club that hates freedom and ought to be abolished and comes straight from the pit of hell? Well, if you teach that to your children, you're violating their human right to education, according to Article 26. This guy was the first head of UNESCO, the UN's education agency, and he was very open about the fact that the purpose of the UN's education agency was to build in the minds of children the idea that we need political unification in a world government. They put out a pamphlet in 1949 saying that schools should combat family attitudes, and a lot happened between then and the 1990s, but I want to just fast forward in the interest of time. They brought all the governments of the world together in Thailand in 1990, and they ratified this international agreement on education. They called Education for All the Jomtien Declaration, and you can read it. In Article 5, they tell you that all kids all over the world need to be subjected to the same standards of learning, and then they tell you in Article 10 that the basic learning content required by all human beings is not a responsibility of the family, or your local school district, or Congress, or your state legislature, or even the Supreme Court. It's a common and universal responsibility. So now Kim Jong-un and Robert Mugabe and Fidel Castro get to help decide what should be the basic learning content required by all human beings. Right? That's what they're saying. And then fast forward another 10 years, they got together in Dakar in Senegal, all the governments of the world, and they went even further. They said that governments must implement integrated strategies which recognize the need for changes in attitudes, values, and practices. And here's the Secretary General of the UN telling you what the purpose of education should be 15 years after that.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So education needs to produce global citizens. And here we thought it was about teaching our kids how to read and write and think. Oh, no, it's for producing global citizens. We don't want American citizens anymore. In 2016, the UN came up with a global action plan for education, and they got even bolder. They said that education should include the integrated development of the whole person, including their spirituality. And trust me, they don't mean teaching your children the Ten Commandments. They say that education must advance the cause of global citizenship, and we'll come back to that spirituality thing in a moment. This lady here was the head of UNESCO, the UN's education agency, until last year. She's also a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She served the mass-murdering dictatorship there that slaughtered about 222,000 innocent people, primarily Christians and liberty-minded people who would not accept communism. And she served the regime faithfully in various high-level positions. She was educated at the elite KGB school in Moscow. Her father was on the Politburo of the mass-murdering Bulgarian Bulgarian Communist Party, and she hates me with a special passion, and that makes me happy. But while she was running UNESCO, they had a mailing list for journalists, and this is one of the press releases they sent out. They said, quoting her, "We have the collective duty to empower every child with the right values to shape the future as responsible global citizens." In the interest of time, we'll skip through it. If you go to UNESCO, their webpage, they have what they call the UN Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, and if you read it, and this was still up as of 2 weeks ago when I last checked, it's hard to believe they put this online, but it really reveals what they're thinking. They say more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So they're telling you right there, they don't want your kids to be well educated. They might have high incomes and consume more resources, right? This is a board game that UNESCO produced for 8 to 10-year-olds. It's in government schools all over the world. And the kids are supposed to answer questions about, and if they get the question right, they can move to the next square. And this one, what is the best way to fight poverty? Well, if you have two brain cells to rub together, you know the private property rights, right? That does the trick. That's why America and Switzerland and New Zealand and Canada and Japan are so enormously wealthy, while countries where share of the wealth produced in the world is implemented are so poor, right? You can go to Venezuela and see how well that works out. They don't have toilet paper, they don't have medicine. The average Venezuelan lost about 25 pounds last year due to malnutrition. They can't even keep the lights on in the capital, even though they have the largest oil reserves in the world. So that tells you how well that idea works out. Or you can go to Cuba or the Soviet Union or North Korea or Zimbabwe, and you can see very clearly that this is not the best way to fight poverty, unless by fight poverty you mean make everybody poor, right? But anyways, that's what they're teaching the children. Here's UNESCO bragging about how they're going to bring this all about.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN's specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
So UNESCO is helping countries to build better education systems, and they're monitoring our progress to make sure we all stay on track, right? Because global education, right? That's what we need. And you think, well, that's not in America. Oh, yes, it is, right? Here's Arnie Duncan. He spent 7 years as Secretary of Education under Obama. He gave a speech to UNESCO in 2010. And you should go read it. It's still on the Department of Education's website. He called UNESCO the global partner of the U.S. government. He bragged that they were turning children everywhere into green global citizens. He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one, but because we need a whole other presentation. But he said, quoting the communist terrorist, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." And here we thought education was just a tool to teach our kids how to read and write and think. Well, they're calling it a weapon to change the world. Did you know that education was a weapon to change the world, and your children are being conscripted in this agenda? He said education is a global public good, unconstrained by national boundaries. So it's not even about your local school district. It's not even about Congress anymore. It's a global public good. In another speech he gave to a green group, he said, "We must advance the sustainability movement of education." And see, again, we thought it was for teaching the kids to read and write and do math. He said the U.S. government was working to build the science of sustainability into the whole curriculum, starting in kindergarten, going through when the kids graduate from high school. Now, we really do have a global education system. We have a world core curriculum. And the resemblance to the Common Core is more than coincidental, as we'll see. It was developed by that guy Robert Mueller from the United Nations. He was the Assistant Secretary General. And he wrote in this letter about the World Core Curriculum that it was the product of the United Nations, the meta-organism of human and planetary evolution. He once called the United Nations the body of Christ. I'm serious. And he wrote in this letter, it was directed to all the educators in the world. He said that this was a curriculum of our universal knowledge which should be taught in all the schools of the earth. So again, Common Core for the world. And if you get the teacher's manual for this World Core curriculum, he'll tell you, he wrote the foreword, he says that the underlying philosophy upon which this is based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Jwal Khul. And almost no Americans know who Alice Bailey was. She was one of the founding people of the New Age movement, and she was also the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. So you got to give her credit for the honesty. They now changed the name to the Lucius Trust because the Lucifer Publishing Company was a little bit too obvious what they were working on. And then this Tibetan teacher that he talks about, Jwal Khul, turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's not even actually a person. Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with these, what she called ascended masters, these spiritual entities, and she would summon them, and she said they would take over her body. Exactly, they're demons. If you've read your Bible, you know what we're talking about. It's not ascended masters. But they would take over her body and write these books. One of the books, and you should read them, they're absolutely insane. But this is one of the books, Education in the New Age. And if you really want to know what's happening in education, you got to read this book. Her demons wrote it. It's called the Education in the New Age. She wrote, or they wrote, world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened, with a world federation and a world brain. Which, you know, in this age of the internet where everything's getting connected, it kind of takes on a whole new meaning. It says our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism and neo-scholasticism provide for their followers, but to get this by the freely chosen cooperative methods that John Dewey advocated. So now we're back full circle to Mr. John Dewey, right? Funny how that works. And they're bragging now that we are now in a global education era. In 2015, in their Education for All report, they said, oh, when we started this in 1990, only 12 countries had national standards with national tests. By the time 2013 came around, we had gotten that number up to over 100. In America, we do have this now. It's called Common Core. And Bill Gates, who sunk about $2 billion of his own money into Common Core, largest funder of Common Core other than taxpayers in America, and obviously he sends his kids to an elite private school, and one of their selling points, if you go to the website, we don't use Common Core, right? So it's good enough for your children, not for his. But he actually went over to UNESCO. There he is with the head of UNESCO at the time in 2004. And they signed an agreement. He signed on behalf of Microsoft. They agreed they would create a global master curriculum and global standards for the whole world. And they wrote in the agreement that Microsoft supports the objectives of UNESCO. This is actually a propaganda video that was created by the people who brought you Common Core. And I want you to hear it from them rather than from me.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone.
Isn't that nice? So the kids in Chicago, St. Louis will learn the same thing as the kids in Shanghai and Paris. Just what we need, right? An education for our kids like the communist Chinese get. That'll work out well. Unfortunately, this has not stopped under the Trump administration. A lot of people think we're in the clear right now. We are absolutely not. Betsy DeVos, who's the current education secretary, went down to Argentina last year and signed an agreement with the G20, including mass murder and dictatorship in China, the Saudi Arabian dictatorship that'll chop her head off for becoming a Christian. They all agreed to work on infusing their shared values into the curriculum all over the world. One of the shared values is sustainable development. Again, we went over that at the beginning. Just take what God ordained, flip it upside down. And also as part of this agreement, we commit to facilitating the internationalization of education. So this is all still very much going on. Trump did get us out of UNESCO, but so did Ronald Reagan, and they got us right back in as soon as he was gone. That's going to happen after Trump. And back to the polling data, right? 55% of young Americans want to live under socialism. Here's the religious affiliations of Americans. You see Protestant Christianity in steep, almost terminal decline in the United States. The green line is the Catholic Church. They're staying even only because the southern border is open and a lot of people from Latin America come in. And then you see the red line, which is rising very, very quickly. That's the nones, right? The humanists, the atheists, the secularists, the agnostics. And notice them rising so quick that within 10 years, they're going to be the dominant religious group in America. They may already be that because, a lot of people who call themselves Christians are Christians in name only. They're really humanists. And this is all a direct result of the government school system, right? We once had a very godly educational system that was founded on the truth contained in the Bible. Today, that's all gone, and they are teaching your children to be anti-Christian secularists. Now, everything I just showed you is a documented fact. I used primary sources so that there wouldn't be any debate as to interpretation. You saw the videos, you heard them say it. Now I'm just going to give you a few minutes about the solutions as I see them, right? So from here on out, we're really dealing with my opinion, and I'll bring in God's opinion on a few occasions. I'll bring in some Bible verses so you can see what God says about these things. So I think the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves a few questions, a few very important questions. The first one is, can we reform this system? And the short answer is no. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. If you take your car to the mechanic and it's running perfectly and you say, hey, can you fix this for me? They'll say, wait a minute, what's wrong with you? Just give me more money and then I'll fix it for you. So of course we can't fix this. It's doing exactly what it was supposed to do, which is brainwash and indoctrinate and dumb down our children. This guy was actually one of the guys who was working on the conspiracy to create a government school system. His name was Orestes Brownson. And he said the great object, he actually repented, he came to Christ and repented of the evil he was working on and tried to blow the whistle about what they were doing. He said the great object of this was to get rid of Christianity. And they weren't going to openly attack religion, but they were going to set up a system of state and national schools where all religion would be excluded and parents would be compelled by law to send their children. Well, back when he said this was a radical idea. Nobody thought it would actually happen, and of course it did, right? One good idea, when we talk about reform, is to shut down the Department of Education. It's a great idea. This is Congressman Thomas Massey. I had the opportunity to interview him in October of last year about some of the bills he's got. He's got some really good ones, including H.R. 899 to shut down the Department of Education. It's a wonderful bill. I wholeheartedly support it.
You have a bill about the Education Department that would wind down the Education Department. Why should we wind down the Education Department?
Oh, wow. How much time do you have? Okay. So, first of all, the Department of Education was established by Jimmy Carter as a re-election tactic, as a ploy. And it's been part of Ronald Reagan's platform and the Republican platform to eliminate the Department of Education. But I saw an opportunity to reintroduce this notion, and as a bill, when everybody got upset about Betsy DeVos's confirmation. That was the last controversial confirmation, was the Secretary of Education, because the left understands this is where you win or lose, is in the schools and in the teaching of the children. So I got a lot of phone calls from constituents and frankly liberals all over the country who wanted me to vote against Betsy DeVos. Well, there's only one problem with that. I'm in the House, I'm not in the Senate. So the Senate has the power of advice and consent according to the Constitution. So my staff would tell the callers, and there were lots of callers, he doesn't get to vote on that. Well, the callers would insist that I was passing the buck, that there was something I could do, and that I must do something. So I wrote a one-page bill, and it says, the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. And I introduced that the day they were voting on her confirmation. That was my effort that they asked of me. And so then when the callers ask, what are you doing to stop Betsy DeVos? We say now, well, we're trying to eliminate the department and thus eliminate her job. She would no longer be employed by the Department of Education. It wouldn't exist. And some of them get upset at that notion, and then I ask the liberals who want the federal government involved, I say, do you really want President Trump deciding what or how your children learn? And so now you've got a situation where the left has to advocate for President Trump controlling their child's education if they want to keep the Department of Education.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's actually going to solve the problem, because I think there's a misconception that if we cut off the head of the snake, being the Department of Education, all these problems will go away. Well, we're not dealing with a snake anymore. We're dealing with a hydra. And the Department of Education is just one tentacle among many that have brought this situation about. So I love the bill. I think we should support it, but it's not going to solve the problem. So now we get to the real issue. As I see it, we have two options. Option one, we get our children out in massive numbers from the public education system. Option two, we just get ready to live under planetary serfdom. What these guys were telling us about, right? The New World Order, where the incredible United Nations is going to use its peacekeeping troops to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. We can start getting ready for that, because when we are successful, and we will be as long as we have 87% of your kids in our brainwash camps for 12 years, there's no other option, folks, as I see it, unless God intervenes and brings us a miracle, which is possible, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for it. Do we really deserve it? Definitely not. So progressives are winning, and they're going to keep winning, and they're going to win until they're tired of winning, which is not going to happen, right? There is good news, though. Only 3 out of 10 American parents would choose government schools as the place to send their children if they had a choice, right? Or if they realized they had a choice. So that means 7 out of 10 American parents would not send their children to a government school. Now, our challenge is to show those 7 out of 10 parents that not only would it be a good idea to do what you think you need to do, it's necessary to do it. You must do it. Your children are at risk. And so we're arguing, I borrowed this term from my friend E. Ray Moore, founder of the Exodus Mandate, we're arguing that we need a Dunkirk operation, right? If you went to government school in the last 20 years, maybe you need a refresher. What happened at Dunkirk, you had the British military was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk on the verge of being annihilated by Hitler's National Socialists. And all of British society, they got on their knees, they prayed, God, help us save our men. And they took every resource, everything that would float, went across the English Channel, they picked up as many boys as they could and brought them back so they could live to fight another day. Long story short, it worked. They rescued their guys and they lived to fight another day. They're not speaking German today. I'm happy to report the National Socialists did not succeed, but the global socialists will succeed if we don't protect our children and get every tool we have at our disposal to get them out of the system. And you know, that means everything, right? With grandparents, you can help your kids. Parents, get your kids out. I know it's a sacrifice. Trust me, I do it. It's, you know, it's not easy living on one low income, but hey, it's worth it, right? So parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everybody in the family can help out on this. Pastors, priests, and rabbis, you know, there's a lot of work here for you guys too. First and foremost, you should sound the alarm in your congregation. You know, a lot of parents don't realize how bad the situation is. If they knew, they wouldn't send their children there. And so you have a duty as the shepherd of your flock to help get them out. You can also help provide alternatives. You know, maybe if your church is not big enough to support a Christian school, maybe you can get together with 10 other pastors in your community and set up a Christian school. Maybe you can partner with one of these online schools now. There's a lot of really great online schools. They can set up a school right in your church. All kinds of options. You can set up a scholarship fund for low-income parents to get their children into a good private school, a good Christian school, you know, or homeschool, whatever the case may be. But if pastors were speaking out, we would not be in the predicament that we're in today. We also need to ask ourselves a few questions about education. Why should we have an education? Why do we even do this? Right? Why do we spend 12 years educating kids? Is it so they can be college and career ready, as the Common Core standard says? They can get a good job and retire in Florida? No. And then who should be in charge of education? Well, God tells us a lot about all these issues, and he says in Proverbs 22:6 that Caesar should train up a child in the way he should go. And you guys are all looking at me funny, because of course it's not for Caesar, right? It's for parents to train up children in the way that they should go. And even when they're old, they will not depart from it. If Caesar trains them up, they won't depart from the way Caesar wants them to go. And you guys know what Caesar's up to. We do not want our children going that way. Here he says that you, as in parents, should teach these laws to your children. Here's in Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, right, and mothers too, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then, you know, what is the purpose of education? What goes into an education? Well, God tells us in Proverbs 9:10 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He tells us in Proverbs 1:7 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And we all in this room know that the Lord is about as welcome in a public school today as headlights. You know, maybe less welcome. And so, do you think your kids are getting wisdom? Do you think they're getting knowledge? Of course they're not, right? They're not getting any of that. They're getting a counterfeit education. Martin Luther pointed out that if the schools were not diligently teaching the scriptures to the children, then they would become the great gates of hell. And he was right. Harvard once understood the purpose of an education. They said every student should be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and his studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom is the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. This was back when Harvard was a good school. John Milton, one of the greatest thinkers of Western civilization, said the end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents. And by regaining to know God aright. And out of that knowledge, to love him, to imitate him, and to be like him. For the Catholics in the room, the Pope also explained that you know, if you're teaching children just the forces of nature and you're excluding God, then that is false and full of error. Right? So the Christian church has understood this forever. Right? We do homeschooling. We follow these guys, right? Most of these guys here, well, all of these guys here never once stepped foot in a government school. Most of their education took place at home. Their parents taught them how to read. And then if they did get any formal schooling, you know, some of them went on to get a college degree. If you spent a couple of years at a private academy or with help from a tutor, that's where they learned Latin and Greek and Hebrew and navigation and engineering and the history of the world and these kinds of things, right? So these guys were able to build the best, freest, most amazing, most prosperous country in the history of the world without ever having stepped one toe into a government school. We don't need government schools to educate our children. We have over 2.5 million homeschool children in America today. One of the brightest spots on the educational horizon. This is one of the things that gives me hope. And homeschoolers are beating the pants off the government school kids, even on the government's own tests. On the government's standardized academic tests, average scores of 50th percentile, homeschoolers end up between 80th and 90th percentile on average every year. And that's at about 5% of the cost. An average homeschool family spends about $500 a year on homeschooling. I literally spend more brainwashing other people's children through my property taxes than I spend educating my own children, and yet homeschool children are running in circles around the victims of the government school system. And this is true even if the parents only have a high school diploma or don't even have a high school diploma. So you don't need to be some kind of PhD in education to educate your kids. Homeschoolers are winning all the spelling bees, science fairs. They're better at every metric that we can measure of socialization. They have better self-image, less problem behaviors, less peer dependence, better communication skills. They do better as adults. They do better in college. They get better jobs. They earn more money. Their marriages fall apart less frequently. They do less drugs. They go to jail less often. They're just beating on every metric. Not everybody's called to homeschool though, so there are a lot of really great private schools out there. Catholic schools have historically been regarded as very, very good. Unfortunately, I have some bad news. About half of them today, about half of all the Catholic dioceses in the United States use Common Core. And you can't put lipstick on a pig, to quote from Sarah Palin. Or you can, but it doesn't make a difference. It's still a pig, right? There's a lot of good Protestant schools out there too. There's a lot of good Jewish schools out there too, but I should warn you, a lot of them are just carbon copies of the government school system. Some of them are even using the same government school textbooks that teach them that they came from slime and there is no God. Right? So you got to be careful. You got to do your due diligence. You wouldn't let a stranger come in off the street and teach your children. Don't send your children to any random school. Make sure you do your due diligence. I work with the Freedom Project Academy. There's some flyers over there on the free table if you have any interest. It's an online K-12 school. There's several of these now that are really good. This is one. It's very cost effective. About $2,200 will get you a whole year for the child. There's scholarships available for people who still can't afford that. You get a classical education along the lines of what the founders got. You'll learn how to read with phonics. You'll get a Christian worldview. You'll get real history, real science. And we need to recognize that the UN and the federal government and our state governments are not going to just allow us to teach our children properly into the indefinite future. In fact, they've already told us they're not going to. In many countries now, they've already criminalized homeschooling. I lived in Sweden when they banned homeschooling there and started kidnapping homeschool children. Sweden's about 20 years ahead of us on the craziness scale, and so that's coming here eventually. The UN in 2015, the Dictator-Controlled Human Rights Council, said that governments must monitor and regulate all non-government education and that they all must use the same standard. And I think the reason why is obvious, right? They're worried that that one kid is going to stand up and say, hey, the emperor is naked. And then everybody's going to suddenly realize. So they don't want one kid to escape the brainwashing, and they're determined to make that happen. And here we are. We're all fighting really important battles, and I know it. I am too. We're fighting to protect the unborn babies, and fighting to reduce our taxes, and fighting to secure the border, and get the globalist UN out of here. We've all got really important battles we're fighting. We're fighting to protect the Second Amendment, and preparing for a worst-case scenario. They can take my guns from my cold, dead hands. And don't misunderstand me. Don't get me wrong. They can take my guns from my cold, dead hands. They will never get them unless I'm dead. But they're laughing at us, right? What are we going to do with our guns? They've got our kids. You're going to use your guns against your kids? Well, of course you're not. And so what good are your guns going to do if they brainwash all your kids? None whatsoever, right? So we need to recognize that as long as they have the kids, this battle, absent divine intervention, is lost. All these battles are lost. We're going to lose on the abortion fight, the tax fight, the border fight, all of them, unless we get our kids out. And Hitler explained this very well. He said, when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. You will pass on, but your descendants now stand firmly in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. And that's where we are today, folks. A lot of our children know nothing else but this new community. And that was Hitler's strategy. That was Lenin's strategy. That was Stalin's strategy. That was Mao's strategy. Every dictator of the last century understood if we can brainwash the kids, we can perpetuate our power indefinitely, right? We need an exodus from the government schools of biblical proportions. We need millions and millions of kids out, and we can take an inspiration from our founding fathers. They put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line against insurmountable odds, right? They went up against the most powerful military in the world, and they did it all for God, for freedom, and for country. So we should take an inspiration from them. Fortunately, we don't need to risk our lives, our sacred honor, and our fortunes. It's a rather small sacrifice, all considered, to get our kids out of the system. It is a sacrifice, I won't lie. I know how much of a sacrifice it is, but it's a lot smaller than what our founders put on the line. And it's got a lot of side benefits, right? We're not going to be hanged for treason, but we will get smarter, happier, better educated, functioning children. And I don't want anybody to leave here thinking also this is just a political fight, or it's just an economic fight, or an educational fight. Alice Bailey understood what kind of fight we're in. John Dewey understood what kind of fight we're in. And we need to understand what kind of fight we're in. God told us in Ephesians 6:12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're dealing with, folks. We are dealing with spiritual wickedness. We're dealing with evil. Don't send your children to people who have these kinds of nefarious intentions. If you're not familiar with the John Birch Society yet, or if you're not involved with the John Birch Society yet, you should check it out. It's named after this guy, Captain John Birch, who was a Christian missionary who went to China to take the gospel to the people there. He put his ministry on kind of pause. I mean, he never stopped preaching the gospel, but he did join military intelligence when World War II broke out, served his country, helped defeat Japan, and then shortly after the war was over, he was murdered by Chinese communists. So we consider him to be, a stellar example of what it means to be an American, and that's why the society is named after him. I believe it is the John Birch Society that has kept America as free as it is for the last 60 years. Without them, I think we would have already been living under slavery, if we'd be living at all. And they do it quietly. Nobody toots the John Birch Society's horn. Actually, the guy who was pushing for a North American Union in his book right before he died, Robert Pastor, he was the lead guy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He wrote that it was the John Birch Society that had stopped any progress on their agenda during the Bush and the Obama administrations. So, you never hear about this from the fake news, but it was the JBS that got chapters in all 50 states working to educate people very strategically. And what we did, the John Birch Society, to stop the North American Union, we got 1 million copies of a special report we did of the New American Magazine out. And so, I'm going to ask you in just a moment to help us do that again. If you have friends in Seattle, in Portland, in Los Angeles, in Lodi, in Phoenix, in Albuquerque, in Texas, send them to libertysentinel.org/tour. They can find my whole schedule there. I'd love it if they would come out and hear this message as well. And I'm going to ask you just for one thing. We've got copies, or I don't, but somebody does, copies in the back. I think they're asking for $1 or $2 per magazine. Is it $1 or $2?
$1.
$1, very good. So that's like the cost that they pay. For $1, you can get a copy of this special report we did on education. And I mentioned earlier, we stopped the North American Union, at least temporarily. We got 1 million copies of the special report in the New American Magazine out to opinion molders, to pastors, to businessmen, to political activists, to neighbors. And through that tool, we were able to stop all progress on that for 2 administrations. And they're back again, they're still working on it, but we've held them off for a long time. We want to get 1 million copies of this one out. This is basically, an expanded version of this presentation. So read it from front to back, and if you agree that this is the most important thing right now that we could be focusing on, right? If we lose our kids, we're going to lose our freedom, we're going to lose every single battle you're working on. So you don't need to spend all your time on this, but if you would help us get copies of this out, maybe go back and order 10 or 100, or some people have ordered 1,000 now, all across America. Help us get 1 million copies of this out. We think we can rescue enough children to give us a fighting chance to protect our country, to protect our liberties, to protect our Constitution. And that's all, folks. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you all. God bless America.